I emptied my entire life savings to buy a bankrupt company. The day I signed the contract, my parents called me a fool, and my brother laughed in my face, calling me a hopeless failure. But just 1 week later, what I uncovered hidden in a sealed storage room beneath the facility left them all absolutely speechless. My name is Abigail. I am 33 years old, and I work as a supply chain manager. If you have ever been the scapegoat of your family, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoy seeing arrogant people get exactly what they truly deserve. Growing up in our family meant adhering to a strict hierarchy of success where real estate and flashy wealth always trumped hard work. Tonight was supposed to be a standard Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' lavish Connecticut estate. The dining room table groaned under the weight of crystal decanters, silver platters, and a perfectly roasted turkey that no one had touched. My mother, Patricia, sat at the head of the table adjusting her designer pearls. My father, Richard, swirled his glass of bourbon. Across from me sat my older brother, Trent, the undisputed golden child of the entire wealthy family. Beside Trent sat his brilliant African-American wife, Jasmine, a corporate lawyer who usually stayed out of our toxic family crossfire entirely. The tension shattered when Trent reached into his tailored suit jacket and tossed a folded stack of papers directly onto my dinner plate. The documents landed right in my mashed potatoes. I looked down and recognized the municipal bankruptcy filings for Apex Packaging. It was the printing and warehouse facility I had officially purchased 48 hours ago. Trent leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass with a cruel smirk on his face. He announced loudly to everyone that his little sister had finally lost her mind. He laughed, proclaiming that I had just flushed $150,000 of my hard-earned life savings down the drain for a completely useless, rotting pile of old bricks. My mother did not even try to hide her disgust. She dropped her heavy silver fork onto her china plate with a loud clatter. She looked at me as if I were a stain on her pristine tablecloth. She called me a perpetual disappointment. She crossed her arms and sneered that I was repeating the exact same pathetic mistakes I made when I was 22 years old. She reminded the table how I had foolishly dropped out of my prestigious university master degree program just to go work in dirty warehouses, throwing away my future to surround myself with cardboard boxes and shipping manifests instead of building a truly respectable professional career. I picked up a napkin and wiped a smudge of gravy off the filing. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and asked a simple, pointed question. I asked if her memory was failing her. I clearly reminded her that I did not drop out of my master degree program to find myself. I dropped out to work 2 grueling supply chain shifts because someone had to secretly pay off the massive legal restitution. I turned my gaze to Trent and stated loudly that I worked those warehouse jobs to pay for the out-of-court settlement after Trent drunkenly crashed our father Porsche into a storefront and fled the chaotic scene immediately. The silence in the dining room was absolute. Jasmine froze with her wineglass held halfway to her lips. Her sharp eyes darted from me to her husband. As a meticulous corporate attorney, Jasmine despised lies, and it was instantly obvious from the shock on her face that Trent had buried this criminal secret from her entirely. Trent's smug smile vanished, replaced by a dark, angry flush creeping up his neck. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware, and yelled at me to keep my mouth shut about things that happened over a decade ago. But the damage was done, and the ugly truth was finally exposed completely for his wife to clearly hear right now. My father Richard immediately stepped in to protect his golden boy. He pointed a stern finger at me and demanded respect. He proclaimed that Trent was currently finalizing a massive deal of $500 million smart city development called Silicon Vista that would cement our family legacy forever. Richard stated that Trent Visionary Real Estate Project required immediate liquid capital to pass the final phase of municipal zoning approvals. My father then looked at me with cold calculation. He ordered me to take out a second mortgage on my condo and transfer the cash amount to Trent by early Monday morning. I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me, realizing he only viewed me as an emergency bank account for his favorite child. I placed my cloth napkin neatly beside my plate and stood up from the table. I told my father, absolutely not. I explained that my money was fully invested in Apex Packaging, a strategic supply chain acquisition, and I would never mortgage my home to fund Trent bloated vanity projects. I calmly added that Trent's business model was built on shortcuts, and I refused to sponsor his ultimate downfall. Patricia gasped in exaggerated horror. Richard stood angrily up his chair, scraping violently. He roared that I was an ungrateful wretch who contributed nothing to the family name. He told me if I walked out, I was dead to them. He swore I would fail spectacularly with my bankrupt warehouse. I did not argue. I simply picked up my coat, told my family to enjoy their cold turkey, and walked out into the freezing November night, completely trusting my own sound business logic always and forever now. Midnight arrived with a bitterly freezing chill as I parked my sedan outside the chain-link fence of Apex Packaging. The massive industrial structure loomed against the dark sky, a sharp contrast to the warm, glittering mansion I had walked away from. The brick exterior was crumbling in places, and the windows were completely boarded up. My family saw this building as a rotting monument to my supposed failure, but standing in the vast, empty parking lot, I only saw untapped potential. I grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from my trunk and walked swiftly toward the main loading dock entrance. I bypassed the dusty main office on the ground floor. I already knew what was in there from the initial property inspection. Instead, I headed straight for the stairwell leading down to the subterranean levels. The air grew damp and heavy with the scent of old paper and rusted metal. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating concrete walls lined with decaying electrical boxes. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped in front of a solid steel door. The heavy door was padlocked and sealed with yellow warning tape that had faded over the long passing years. This was the primary storage room, a space the bankruptcy liquidators had deemed too hazardous and flooded to properly inventory. I wedged the flat edge of my crowbar behind the rusted padlock. I pushed down with all my body weight, my muscles burning with the effort. The metal groaned and snapped with a loud crack that echoed loudly through the empty basement. I pulled the heavy door open, stepping into a cavernous room filled with rows of metal filing cabinets. Water damage had destroyed the bottom drawers, leaving a thick layer of dried mud across the entire concrete floor today. As I stood alone in the freezing dark room, a brief moment of doubt washed over me. My mother's voice echoed in my head, calling me a perpetual disappointment. My father's threat rang in my ears, promising that I would fail spectacularly. For a fraction of a second, I wondered if I really had made a terrible mistake. But I am a supply chain manager. I deal in hard data logistics and undeniable facts, not emotional manipulation. I took a deep breath, shook the toxic voices from my mind, and walked deeper into the dark maze of metal cabinets now. I began systematically pulling open the top drawers of the filing cabinets, searching for anything the liquidators might have missed. Most of the files were worthless, containing decades of old vendor invoices, employee time cards, and maintenance logs for printing machines that no longer existed. I spent 2 hours sorting through the damp, moldy folders. My hands were covered in dust, and the freezing temperature was seeping into my bones. I was about to give up and head upstairs when my flashlight beam caught something unusual in the back corner of the room beneath a pile of blue blueprints. Carefully, I moved the heavy rolled-up blueprints aside, my heart beating slightly faster. Hidden beneath the architectural drawings was a solid iron floor safe bolted directly into the foundation. It had been concealed from the casual observer. The dial was rusted shut, but the hinges looked weak from years of moisture exposure. I retrieved my crowbar and wedged it into the gap between the heavy door and the iron frame. I pushed down repeatedly, using the leverage to slowly bend the locking mechanism. Metal shrieked against metal until the locking pins finally gave way with a heavy, loud thud easily. I pulled the heavy safe door open, revealing a dry interior. The thick iron had protected the contents from the basement flooding. Inside sat a single thick leather envelope sealed with red wax. I carefully lifted the envelope, the leather feeling stiff and brittle under my fingers. I broke the wax seal and slid the contents out onto the top of a nearby filing cabinet. The first document was a stack of yellowed heavy parchment paper. I shined my flashlight on the bold text at the top of the first page, reading all the old legal jargon very carefully today. It was an original, irrevocable land deed dating back 50 years. As I read the property boundaries, a cold smile spread across my face. The deed granted Apex Packaging exclusive permanent subterranean access rights to the entire surrounding commercial block. This included the municipal cooling pipes and the only viable electrical substation access. The exact same infrastructure grid that Trent required to build his $500 million smart city development. Without this specific land access, Trent's entire project was essentially paralyzed. He could not run water or power to Silicon Vista without my express written legal permission ever again. But the old land deed was not the only treasure inside the safe. I reached into the envelope again and pulled out a second document. This one was a highly detailed technical manual bearing a federal registration seal. It was a fully approved 15-year-old patent for a high-grade eco-friendly polymer insulation. I scanned the chemical breakdown and the structural application notes. My breath caught in my throat. This was the exact revolutionary thermal technology that Trent was currently pitching to his billionaire investors as his own proprietary invention to secure his massive smart city funding instantly. Trent had assumed that when Apex Packaging went bankrupt, this forgotten patent had permanently died with the company. But he was incredibly mistaken. By purchasing the corporate entity and all its assets, I legally acquired total ownership of its intellectual property. I held the sole legal rights to the exact technology Trent was using to build his empire. I snapped a clear photo of the patent document on my phone. I looked around the dark, freezing storage room and smirked into the shadows. So this is how you plan to secure your $500 million funding right now, Trent? The morning sun had barely crested the industrial skyline when the sound of heavy tires crunching over broken glass and loose gravel echoed through the empty loading bay. I had not slept a single wink. Instead, I had spent the remaining hours of the night securing the safe and moving the documents into my locked briefcase. I stood on the cracked concrete of the main entrance holding a lukewarm cup of cheap diner coffee. A pristine white municipal SUV rolled to a stop directly in front of the warehouse doors. Right behind it parked a sleek black town car. Two men wearing neon safety vests and white hard hats stepped out of the SUV holding thick clipboards. They carried themselves with the arrogant swagger of city officials who were used to bullying small business owners into submission. But my attention was entirely focused on the woman emerging from the black town car. It was Jasmine. Trent's elegant and razor-sharp African-American wife. She wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit and carried a designer leather tote, stepping carefully over the debris in her expensive heels. As Trent chief legal counsel, Jasmine was brilliant, pragmatic, and ruthless in the courtroom. But she also possessed a strict moral compass. She despised corporate corruption and operated strictly within the boundaries of the law. I watched her approach, analyzing her body language. She did not look triumphant. She looked genuinely exhausted and deeply uncomfortable. The two building inspectors flanked her like bodyguards. The taller inspector stepped forward and puffed out his chest, demanding to know if I was the registered owner of Apex Packaging. I took a slow sip of my coffee and nodded, holding his gaze until he shifted uncomfortably. He thrust a clipboard toward me, pointing a thick finger at a bright red piece of paper attached to the front. He aggressively informed me that they were issuing an immediate municipal condemnation notice for the entire property. He cited severe structural instability, hazardous asbestos exposure, and critical environmental code violations. He barked that the building was officially deemed a public safety hazard, and I was ordered to vacate the premises within 24 hours before demolition protocols were initiated. I did not take the clipboard. I did not even blink. I turned my attention away from the sweating inspector and looked directly at my sister-in-law. Jasmine let out a heavy sigh and signaled the inspectors to step back. She approached me alone, lowering her voice to a sympathetic whisper. Jasmine looked me in the eye and pleaded with me to listen to reason. She told me she was speaking to me right now as family, not as Trent corporate attorney. She explained that the city fines for these specific environmental hazards would exceed $10,000 a day. She warned me that the municipality would place immediate liens on my condo and seize my personal bank accounts to cover the massive penalty fees. Jasmine reached into her designer tote and pulled out a crisp manila folder. She handed the folder to me with a look of genuine pity. Inside was a standard commercial buyout contract. Jasmine urged me to cut my losses immediately. She said Trent was willing to assume the liability of the hazardous property and pay the municipal fines out of his own pocket. In exchange, he was offering me a flat cash buyout of $50,000 for the deed. She promised that if I signed the paper right now, the inspectors would tear up the condemnation notice and I could walk away clean. I looked at the ridiculous $50,000 offer. Trent was trying to buy the foundational cornerstone of his $500 million smart city project for pennies on the dollar, using his wife as a pawn to deliver the threat. I handed the folder back to Jasmine. I told her I found the offer highly insulting and mathematically absurd. Jasmine shook her head, her expression tightening with frustration and concern. She leaned in closer and warned me that I did not understand how this game was played. She whispered that Trent had friends on the city council, friends on the zoning board, and friends in the inspection office. She bluntly stated that Trent plays dirty and relies on shady shortcuts when cornered. She told me I was a brilliant supply chain manager, but I was entirely out of my depth in the vicious world of commercial real estate. She begged me to take the $50,000 because I simply could not win against his endless resources and municipal connections. I smiled warmly at Jasmine. I truly respected her. I knew she was operating on fabricated information that her husband had fed her. Trent had clearly shown her falsified environmental reports to convince her that this property was genuinely toxic. He had weaponized her legal expertise and her sense of morality to do his dirty work. I set my coffee cup down on a rusted oil drum. I calmly popped the brass latches on my leather briefcase. I told Jasmine that I actually understood commercial real estate much better than Trent realized. I reached inside and pulled out a thick document printed on heavy ivory paper, sealed with a raised golden state crest. I did not hand it to Jasmine. I handed it directly to the aggressive city inspector who had threatened me earlier. I instructed the inspector to read the certification aloud for the group. The man snatched the paper with a scowl, but as his eyes scanned the official letterhead, his face drained of all color. His hands began to tremble slightly. He stammered, trying to pronounce the legal phrasing. I stepped forward and projected my voice clearly over the morning wind. I informed them that they were standing on a site officially protected under the State Historical Preservation Act. I explained that 30 days before I purchased Apex Packaging, I had quietly filed an expedited heritage claim based on the building's unique 1920s industrial architecture and its role in the early regional labor movement. The state Supreme Court had approved the protective zoning status exactly 48 hours ago. I looked at the two inspectors and delivered the killing blow. I stated that municipal-level condemnation notices are completely null and void against state-protected historical landmarks. I warned them that if they even attempted to enforce their fraudulent red tag, I would personally sue the city for state-level jurisdictional overreach and have their individual inspector licenses permanently revoked by noon. The two men panicked. They knew instantly they had been caught operating outside their legal jurisdiction on behalf of a corrupt developer. The taller inspector practically shoved the historical document back into my hands, grabbed his partner by the safety vest, and sprinted back to the white municipal SUV. They peeled out of the parking lot, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Jasmine stood completely paralyzed in the center of the loading bay. Her sharp, legal mind was racing, processing the massive implications of what had just occurred. She looked at the vacant spot where the inspectors had fled, and then looked at me. Her dark eyes were wide with total shock. I gently packed the historical document back into my briefcase. I looked at Jasmine and softly explained the reality of her situation. I told her that historical preservation status is a matter of public record. Any competent real estate developer would have discovered that zoning block during a standard due diligence title search. The realization washed over Jasmine's face like a bucket of ice water. If Trent had conducted a legal property survey, he would have known the warehouse was protected. The only way Trent could have secured a municipal condemnation notice for a state-protected building was by submitting intentionally forged property surveys and bribed inspection reports to the city council. Jasmine realized in that exact moment that her husband had lied to her face. He had lied to his own corporate legal counsel. He had falsified legal documents and tried to use her pristine professional reputation to legitimize a fraudulent property seizure against his own sister. The betrayal in Jasmine's eyes was unmistakable. Her pragmatic composure cracked, revealing a woman deeply disgusted by the man she had married. She did not say a single word to me. She simply turned around, got into her black town car, and told her driver to take her back to the corporate office, immediately leaving Trent's entire legal strategy crumbling in the dirt. My phone buzzed heavily in my coat pocket before Jasmine's car had even turned the corner out of the warehouse district. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I answered the call, fully expecting Patricia to scream at me for humiliating Trent in front of his wife and the city inspectors. Instead, I heard loud, frantic sobbing coming through the speaker. Patricia cried hysterically, begging for my immediate forgiveness. She claimed the Thanksgiving argument was a terrible mistake, fueled by too much wine and intense family stress. She pleaded for a mother-daughter peace treaty lunch at an exclusive downtown steakhouse at noon. She swore it would just be the two of us to talk heal our relationship and move forward as a family. I am a supply chain manager. I analyze calculated risks for a living. I knew Patricia's tears were as fake as her designer pearls, but I also knew that hiding from a direct threat only gives your enemies more power. I agreed to meet her. When I walked into the dimly lit mahogany-paneled dining room of the steakhouse, I immediately spotted the ambush. Patricia was not sitting alone in a quiet, intimate booth for two. She was seated at a large round table right in the center of the VIP dining room. Trent was sitting right beside her, looking incredibly smug and completely recovered from his morning defeat at the loading dock. Sitting across from them was an older man I did not recognize. He wore a bespoke Italian suit and a heavy gold watch that screamed generational wealth. Just as I approached the table, my father Richard stepped out of the shadows from near the bar. He placed a heavy, commanding hand on my shoulder, physically guiding me into the only empty chair. The trap was officially sprung. My mother immediately dropped the weeping victim act she had used on the phone. She took a delicate sip of her martini and smiled coldly at me. Trent leaned forward and introduced the older man as Marcus Vance, the primary billionaire investor for the Silicon Vista Smart City project. Marcus did not offer to shake my hand. He looked at me like I was an annoying insect that had crawled onto his expensive plate. Trent slid a glossy, thick legal document across the crisp, white tablecloth. He told me the historical zoning stunt I pulled this morning was a cute trick, but the game was finally over. He announced generously that Marcus was willing to offer me exactly $100,000 for the Apex packaging deed. Trent called it a family bailout to save me from my own financial ruin. I did not even bother reading the contract. I looked at Trent and asked him if his wife had finished packing her bags yet. Trent's jaw clenched violently and his smug smile wavered. Marcus Vance frowned and tapped his expensive gold pen against the table, demanding my attention. He told me I was entirely out of my depth. He warned me that billion-dollar developments do not stop for stubborn little girls playing warehouse manager. He advised me to take the money and walk away quietly before things got incredibly ugly for me. I pushed the contract back toward the center of the table and clearly stated my property was not for sale at any price. That was when my father Richard decided to drop his respectable patriarch facade. He leaned aggressively over the table, his face turning red with suppressed rage. Richard lowered his voice to a menacing, vicious whisper. He reminded me that he sat on the executive board of the State Commerce Committee. He knew the vice president of every major logistics and supply chain firm on the eastern seaboard. He promised me that if I did not sign that paper right now, he would make one phone call and personally ensure I was permanently blacklisted from my own industry. He swore I would never work in supply chain management again in this state or any other. He said I would lose my condo, go completely bankrupt, and be forced to beg them for minimum wage work at the family manufacturing plant. He pointed a trembling finger at the gold pen and ordered me to sign my name immediately. I looked at the pen. I looked at my mother's smug face, my father pointing finger, and Trent victorious grinning expression. They honestly believed they had broken me. I picked up the heavy legal contract. I gripped the thick, glossy paper with both hands and slowly, deliberately tore the entire document perfectly down the middle. The loud ripping sound caused several nearby wealthy diners to turn and stare at our table. I dropped the torn pieces directly into Trent's glass of ice water, watching the ink begin to bleed. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I turned my attention entirely away from my toxic family and looked directly at the billionaire investor. I asked Marcus Vance a very simple, pointed question. I asked him how his powerful board of directors would react when they found out the foundational infrastructure for his $500 million smart city legally belonged to me. I explained loudly and clearly that the municipal cooling pipes and the electrical substation grid for Silicon Vista ran directly beneath my permanently protected historical warehouse. I watched the color completely drain from Marcus' face as the realization hit him. He turned his head slowly, realizing Trent had lied on the federal due diligence reports regarding the property boundaries. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving a furious billionaire glaring dagger at a violently sweating Trent. While I was walking away from that steakhouse, leaving a furious billionaire and a sweating Trent in my wake, a completely different kind of explosion was brewing across town. Back at the sleek, glass-enclosed Silicon Vista corporate headquarters, Jasmine was beginning to connect the dots. As Trent's chief legal counsel and his wife, she had always operated on the assumption that her husband was arrogant but fundamentally lawful. My revelation at the Thanksgiving dinner table about Trent's hidden criminal past had severely shaken her trust. Now, sitting alone in Trent's lavish penthouse office suite, while he was supposedly at a peace treaty lunch with me, Jasmine decided to conduct her own private audit. Jasmine is a meticulous attorney who despises leaving stones unturned. She opened Trent's mahogany desk and accessed his unlocked primary computer terminal. She bypassed his email and went directly to the secure master files for the Silicon Vista Smart City project. She pulled up the official property lines and deeds that Trent had personally submitted to the municipal zoning board for final approval. Then, using her own secure legal database credentials, she downloaded the original unedited county registry files for the exact same commercial block. She placed the two digital maps side by side on the massive dual monitors. What she saw made her blood run entirely cold. The official county map clearly showed the Apex packaging footprint sitting squarely in the middle of the development zone, securing all the subterranean infrastructure rights. But the map Trent had submitted to the city was completely different. Trent had digitally altered the property lines. He had used architectural rendering software to literally erase the Apex packaging boundaries, merging my legally protected land directly into his own corporate holdings. He had submitted doctored federal and municipal documents to secure a $500 million real estate deal. This was not a clerical error or an aggressive leveraging tactic. It was deliberate, calculated felony-level forgery. The heavy glass doors of the office suddenly swung open. Trent stormed inside violently, throwing his suit jacket onto the leather sofa. He was hyperventilating, his face a blotchy red from the utter humiliation he had just suffered at the steakhouse. Right behind him was my mother, Patricia, clucking like an anxious hen and telling him that I was simply a jealous, spiteful woman who would eventually cave to their demands. Jasmine did not say a word of greeting. She simply turned the large computer monitors toward the center of the room. She stood up, folded her arms, and looked at the man she had married. She calmly demanded to know why he had submitted fraudulent property deeds to the municipal zoning board. She pointed to the glowing screens and clearly stated that he had erased Apex packaging from the legal filings. Trent froze in his tracks. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking pale and cornered. He stammered frantically, waving his hands, and tried to brush the forgery off as a minor logistical projection. He claimed it was just a draft map that his architects had submitted by mistake. Jasmine slammed her hand on the desk, shutting down his lies instantly. She informed him that she was an officer of the court, and she knew exactly what federal wire fraud and municipal forgery looked like. She told him he was facing decades in federal prison, and he had actively used her pristine legal department to launder his crimes. Before Trent could formulate another pathetic excuse, Patricia immediately stepped between them. My mother clutched her designer handbag and glared at Jasmine with absolute disdain. Patricia told Jasmine to lower her voice and stop acting so hysterical over standard corporate paperwork. She scoffed and dismissed the felony forgery as nothing more than creative business tactics and aggressive market maneuvering. Patricia waved her hand dismissively, stating that this was simply how powerful men built empires, and Jasmine was overreacting to a minor technicality. When Jasmine refused to back down, Patricia's toxic nature fully unleashed itself. My mother looked Jasmine up and down with a sneer of pure aristocratic judgment. Patricia delivered a string of vile, calculated microaggressions. She told Jasmine that a girl from her modest background should be infinitely grateful for the luxurious lifestyle that the family had graciously provided for her. Patricia explicitly stated that Trent had elevated Jasmine out of mediocrity, and it was high time she stopped acting like a ruthless street prosecutor. Patricia ordered Jasmine to sit down, keep her mouth shut, and start acting like a supportive traditional wife who stands blindly behind her successful husband. Jasmine stared at my mother and then shifted her gaze to Trent. Trent did not defend his wife. He did not tell his mother to step back. He simply looked away cowardly, allowing Patricia to verbally attack the woman who had spent years protecting him. That silent cowardice was the final breaking point. Jasmine did not scream. She did not cry or throw a tantrum. Her face hardened into a mask of absolute icy resolve. She picked up her designer briefcase and meticulously packed her personal laptop and her legal notepads. She snapped the briefcase shut with a sharp, definitive click that echoed in the quiet office. She looked directly at Trent and Patricia with a gaze so cold it could have frozen boiling water. Without saying a single word to either of them, Jasmine turned and walked out of the glass office. She marched down the executive hallway, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. As she stepped into the private elevator, she pulled her phone from her pocket. She did not call a divorce lawyer or a friend to vent. She dialed a very specific direct extension. When the voice on the other end answered, Jasmine spoke in a clear, unwavering tone. She officially requested an urgent private meeting with the State Bar Ethics Committee. Trent stood paralyzed in his lavish penthouse office, watching the heavy glass door swing shut behind his wife. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. He knew Jasmine better than anyone. She was not bluffing, and she never made empty threats. By contacting the State Bar Ethics Committee, she was systematically dismantling his entire legal shield. The forged property lines, the altered municipal surveys, and the fake environmental hazard reports were about to be exposed to federal investigators. Trent realized with a sickening jolt that his $500 million smart city project was currently sitting on top of a massive ticking time bomb. His only chance of survival was to completely destroy the credibility of the person holding the detonator. He had to neutralize Abigail before anyone could believe her claims about the historical landmark or the subterranean infrastructure rights. Trent bypassed his corporate communications team entirely. He reached into his personal contacts and hired a dark money crisis management firm notorious for executing vicious corporate smear campaigns. He wired them an exorbitant retainer fee from a hidden offshore account and gave them a single directive. He ordered them to digitally annihilate his sister. The PR firm operated with terrifying speed and ruthless efficiency. Within 48 hours, a highly coordinated and heavily funded digital assault was launched against Abigail across every major professional network. It started on LinkedIn. Anonymous accounts posing as former colleagues began publishing viral articles accusing Abigail of gross professional negligence. They claimed she had deliberately sabotaged supply chains, causing millions of dollars in corporate losses. The fabricated posts were artificially boosted by thousands of bot accounts, pushing the lies to the top of every local business feed. Then the fake reviews flooded in. Phony vendor profiles flooded regional industry forums claiming Abigail was a nightmare to work with, an unstable manager who embezzled operational funds and routinely screamed at her logistics staff. They painted a manufactured picture of a deeply unhinged woman who was currently undergoing a severe psychological breakdown. Abigail sat at the small dining table in her condo, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. Her phone had not stopped buzzing since Tuesday morning. The sheer volume of the digital slander was staggering. The PR firm had even created a slick anonymous website entirely dedicated to documenting her supposed professional failures, complete with doctored emails and out-of-context audio clips. As a supply chain manager, Abigail was trained to handle catastrophic system failures objectively. She compartmentalized the emotional betrayal and began assessing the tactical damage. It did not take long for the real-world consequences to manifest. Her phone screen lit up with an incoming call from her largest freelance consulting client, a regional freight distributor that provided the bulk of her monthly income. The vice president of operations was on the line, sounding incredibly panicked. He awkwardly explained that his board of directors had seen the viral LinkedIn articles. He stated that his company simply could not afford to be associated with that level of industry controversy. He terminated her 6-month consulting contract effectively immediately, citing a moral turpitude clause. Less than 2 hours later, her second-largest client, a national packaging supplier, sent a cold automated email completely severing their ties. They cited the exact same fabricated scandals. In the span of a single afternoon, Abigail lost her entire stream of revenue. She opened a new tab on her browser and logged into her personal banking portal. The numbers staring back at her were grim. She had emptied her life savings to purchase the bankrupt Apex packaging warehouse. The municipal filing fees, the historical landmark expedition costs, and her basic living expenses had severely depleted her remaining liquid capital. Without her consulting income, her operating runway had just shrunk from 6 months to less than 3 weeks. Her bank accounts were dipping dangerously low. Trent was trying to starve her out, forcing her into a position where she would have to accept his low-ball buyout offer just to survive. Her phone chimed, signaling a new voicemail. The caller ID belonged to her father, Richard. Abigail tapped the screen and put the message on speaker, allowing her father's cold, calculated voice to fill the quiet condo. Richard did not call to offer support or ask if the horrific rumors online were true. He called to gloat. His voice dripped with arrogant satisfaction. He told her he had warned her about the consequences of defying the family at the Thanksgiving table. He stated that the professional world was a brutal arena, and she had clearly proven she lacked the pedigree to survive it. Richard officially announced that she was formally disowned. He instructed her to stop using the family name to secure any future employment. He sneered that she had brought this total destruction entirely upon herself by stubbornly holding onto a rotting brick warehouse instead of being a compliant, obedient daughter. He finished the message by advising her to pack up her condo before the bank foreclosed on it and brutally hung up the phone. Abigail deleted the voicemail without a flinch. She closed her laptop and walked into her kitchen to pour a glass of water. A sharp, loud knock at her front door shattered the silence of her condo. She checked the peephole and saw a courier standing in the hallway holding a thick, legal envelope. Abigail opened the door and signed the electronic data pad. The courier handed over the heavy package and walked away without a word. She carried the envelope back to her dining table, expecting to find a massive defamation lawsuit from Trent or a final aggressive buyout contract from the billionaire investor Marcus Vance. She broke the heavy seal and slid the crisp, legal documents onto the wood surface. She scanned the bold black text at the top of the first page. It was not a lawsuit. It was an official court summons from the state Supreme Court. Trent had filed an emergency petition for an involuntary medical conservatorship over her entire estate. Abigail read the chilling legal phrasing carefully. Trent had weaponized the fake PR campaign, submitting the viral articles and phony reviews as sworn evidence to a judge. He was officially claiming that Abigail was suffering from a severe psychological collapse and was completely mentally unfit to manage her own financial assets. By declaring her legally insane, Trent was petitioning the court to grant him total control over her life, her bank accounts, and the deed to Apex Packaging. He was bypassing the historical landmark protections entirely by attempting to legally steal the owner mind. I dropped the heavy manila envelope onto my dining table and spread the 50 pages of legal filings under the harsh overhead light. Trent was not just trying to steal my property, he was trying to legally erase my autonomy. I read through the thick stack of documents, my blood turning to ice with every vicious fabricated sentence. The petition was meticulously crafted by a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. It painted a terrifying picture of a severely unhinged woman, making erratic, catastrophic financial decisions. The core evidence, however, was not based on my actual business metrics or my current banking stability. It was based entirely on my medical history from over a decade ago. When I was 22 years old, I had sought professional therapy to survive the severe clinical depression caused directly by my family, relentless psychological abuse. I had spent my entire adolescence being told I was a disappointment simply because I did not fit their shallow aristocratic mold. I had trusted my parents enough back then to use the family health insurance policy to cover my weekly counseling sessions. That was a fatal mistake. Trent had somehow illegally accessed those sealed medical records. He had completely twisted my past trauma, weaponizing my desperate attempts to heal against me in a court of law. The legal brief framed my strategic acquisition of the bankrupt Apex packaging facility not as a brilliant supply chain maneuver, but as a textbook manic episode. Trent claimed I had drained my life savings in a fit of absolute delusion. He stated I was currently a danger to myself and my assets. He argued to the judge that I needed immediate familial intervention to prevent total financial self-destruction. It was a perfectly designed character assassination. If the court granted this conservatorship, I would lose the right to sign contracts, access my own money, or make any legal decisions regarding my own life. Trent would become my legal guardian, and the deed to the warehouse would fall directly into his eager hands. Attached to the very back of the petition was a sworn medical affidavit bearing the signature of Dr. Eris Thorne. My stomach churned when I saw the name. Dr. Thorne was one of the most prominent and fiercely expensive psychiatrists in the state. He frequently testified as an expert witness in high-profile corporate competency hearings. He was widely known as the ultimate fixer for wealthy families who needed to quietly lock away problematic relatives to secure generational fortunes. In his sworn statement, Dr. Thorne claimed he had comprehensively reviewed my medical history and definitively concluded that I was currently experiencing a severe psychotic break. He stated under penalty of perjury that I lacked the fundamental cognitive capacity to manage commercial real estate or negotiate binding legal contracts. Dr. Thorne had never met me. He had never spoken to me. He had never conducted a single psychiatric evaluation of my mental state. Yet here was his official signature rubber stamping my legal execution. I knew instantly that Trent could not have orchestrated this massive legal strike alone. A high-level emergency conservatorship petition required exorbitant legal retainers and massive under-the-table payouts to secure an expert witness of Thorne caliber within 48 hours. My parents had fully funded this maneuver. Richard and Patricia had willingly financed the legal theft of my sanity just to protect Trent's failing smart city project. For a fraction of a second, a wave of profound, suffocating panic threatened to crush my chest. The walls of my condo felt like they were shrinking, closing in on me like a prison cell. They were trying to lock me in a legal cage where I would have no voice, no money, and no rights. But I am a supply chain manager. I do not succumb to emotional panic. I operate on cold, hard data. I track moving targets across the globe, and I untangle massive logistical knots for a living. I took a deep, steadying breath and shoved the emotional betrayal into a dark, locked corner of my mind. I needed to dismantle their attack systematically. I sat down at my laptop and opened my secure financial terminals. If Dr. Thorne was willing to commit perjury on a state Supreme Court affidavit, he did not do it out of family loyalty. He did it for a massive amount of cash. People like Richard and Trent always believe their wealth makes them invisible, but money always leaves a trail. I pulled up the commercial banking software I used to audit corporate ledgers. A few years ago, before I fully separated my finances from the family, Richard had forced me to act as a silent cosigner on a dormant offshore LLC designed to hold emergency manufacturing capital. He had arrogantly assumed I was too naive to understand international wire routing. He forgot that I track global financial logistics every single day. I bypassed the primary firewalls and accessed the archived ledger of the offshore trust. I began running a forensic trace on all recent outbound wire transfers initiated by Richard and Trent. It took me 3 intense hours of meticulous data sorting. My eyes burned from staring at the bright screen, but my focus never wavered. I cross-referenced the dates of the massive offshore wire transfers with the exact day the municipal condemnation notice failed at the warehouse. A sharp, cold smile slowly spread across my face. I had found it. Buried deep within a convoluted maze of corporate shell companies was a massive digital wire transfer authorized directly by Richard. The funds had been routed through a Cayman Islands holding account and deposited cleanly into a domestic trust fund. I traced the specific routing number of that receiving trust, mapping its origin back to a local banking institution. The account was officially registered to the private medical practice of Dr. Eris Thorne. Richard had left a glowing digital footprint of a massive illegal bribe. He had paid a licensed medical professional to perjure himself in a court of law. They thought they had trapped me, but they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them completely. 72 hours later, the sterile fluorescent lighting of Courtroom 4 at the State Supreme Court cast a harsh, unforgiving glow over my family carefully orchestrated performance. Trent, Richard, and Patricia sat clustered together at the petitioner table, projecting the exact image of a heartbroken, deeply concerned family forced to make a tragic decision. They had dressed meticulously for the occasion. Trent wore a subdued dark navy suit, abandoning his usual flashy designer accessories and arrogant posture. Richard sat with his shoulders deliberately slumped, clutching a pristine linen handkerchief in his trembling hands. Patricia had opted for a modest, high-necked black dress, looking every inch the grieving mother desperately trying to save her troubled daughter from herself. Trent, lead attorney, a smooth-talking, high-priced litigator named Harrison, stood before the presiding judge. Judge Caldwell was an older conservative man, known for his sympathetic rulings in family welfare cases. Harrison paced slowly in front of the bench, delivering a masterful opening statement that dripped with manufactured empathy and toxic concern. He painted a devastatingly false portrait of my entire life. He spoke in hushed, respectful tones about my supposed lifelong battle with severe mental instability. He referenced my therapy sessions from my early 20s, twisting my desperate attempts to recover from their emotional abuse into a permanent narrative of chronic, incurable psychological fragility. Harrison turned toward the judge and spread his hands in a gesture of helpless sorrow. He claimed that my recent purchase of the bankrupt Apex packaging warehouse was the ultimate proof of a catastrophic manic episode. He argued forcefully that I had liquidated my entire life savings on a worthless, decaying property simply because I had lost all grip on reality. He cited the fabricated viral LinkedIn articles and the coordinated public relations smear campaign as independent proof of my professional and personal unraveling. Finally, Harrison submitted the sworn affidavit from Dr. Eris Thorne. He tapped the heavy legal document, emphatically stating that a leading medical expert had confirmed I was in immediate danger to my own financial and physical well-being. Patricia let out a perfectly timed, stifled sob, pressing her face into Richard's shoulder. Richard patted her arm, whispering false comforts while looking up at the judge with a pained, tortured expression. Judge Caldwell nodded slowly, his face softening with genuine sympathy for the wealthy, prominent family forced to legally lock away their erratic daughter. Trent leaned back in his leather chair and checked his gold watch. I knew exactly what he was thinking. By filing an emergency ex parte petition, he had deliberately given me less than 48 hours' notice. It was a classic, aggressive legal tactic designed to induce sheer panic. Trent fully expected me to represent myself. He anticipated that I would burst through the courtroom doors, late, disheveled, and completely frantic. He wanted me to scream about historical landmarks and offshore bank accounts and corporate conspiracies so that I would look exactly like the unhinged, paranoid woman Dr. Thorne had described in his fraudulent report. Trent was banking on my emotional collapse to hand him the conservatorship on a silver platter. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open. The heavy brass latches clicked loudly, echoing like a gunshot across the silent room. Every head in the gallery turned. Trent smirked clearly, ready to witness my hysterical breakdown. I stepped across the threshold. I was not crying. I was not frantic. I was not out of breath. I wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal gray suit with a crisp white blouse, my hair pulled back into a severe, sleek twist. I walked down the center aisle with the measured, rhythmic stride of a chief executive walking into a hostile boardroom. My face was a mask of absolute icy composure. But it was not my appearance that caused the smug satisfaction to instantly drain from my brother's face. It was the people walking directly beside me. I was not representing myself. I was flanked by 3 people in immaculate bespoke suits. On my right was Marcus Vance, the ruthless billionaire investor Trent had previously tried to partner with. On my left were 2 senior partners from Vanguard and Sterling, the most feared and aggressive corporate litigation firm in the state. Vanguard and Sterling did not handle family law or mental health conservatorships. They handled billion-dollar corporate fraud, racketeering, and hostile corporate takeovers. They were the legal equivalent of a tactical nuclear strike. Trent's jaw literally dropped. The remaining color vanished from Richard's face, leaving him looking like a panicked ghost. Patricia clutched her pearl necklace, her fake tears drying up instantly as she stared at the 3 legal titans escorting her supposedly bankrupt daughter down the aisle. Harrison stopped pacing. He stared at my legal team with wide, undisguised terror. Every lawyer in the city knew Vanguard and Sterling. They were notoriously selective, incredibly expensive, and they only took cases they could entirely obliterate. The fact that 2 of their senior partners had shown up to a routine emergency conservatorship hearing meant something had gone catastrophically wrong for the petitioners. I reached the defense table and took my seat with slow, deliberate precision. Marcus Vance sat directly behind me in the first row of the gallery, crossing his arms and fixing Trent with a look of pure predatory amusement. My lead counsel, a towering, formidable woman named Evelyn Sterling, stepped up to the table. She did not bring a single medical file or psychiatric evaluation. Instead, she dropped a massive stack of heavy, completely organized forensic financial dossiers onto the solid wood surface. The resounding thud echoed through the courtroom like a gavel striking a block. Judge Caldwell frowned, looking down at the intimidating defense team. He adjusted his glasses, clearly confused by the sudden shift in the courtroom dynamic. He addressed Evelyn, asking why a specialized corporate fraud team was appearing in a standard family conservatorship hearing. Evelyn did not miss a beat. She stood tall, her voice ringing out with absolute, unyielding authority. She informed the judge that she was not there to discuss my mental health. She stated clearly that she was there to submit definitive forensic evidence of a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. She pointed directly at Trent and Richard. She told the court that the entire conservatorship petition was a fraudulent legal maneuver designed to facilitate the theft of protected commercial real estate. Harrison immediately objected, his voice pitching up in panic. He frantically argued that Evelyn was making baseless, inflammatory accusations that had nothing to do with my medical competency. He demanded that the judge focus exclusively on the sworn affidavit provided by Dr. Thorne. Evelyn smiled a sharp, dangerous smile. She calmly reached into the thick stack of forensic dossiers. She extracted a single sheet of paper and held it up for the judge to see. She announced that she was holding the unredacted offshore wire transfer records originating from Richard Personal Holding Company. She stated that exactly 24 hours before Dr. Thorne signed his medical affidavit, Richard had wired $250,000 into the psychiatrist's private domestic trust. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Trent sank down into his chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Richard gripped the edge of the petitioner table, his knuckles turning stark white. Patricia stared at her husband in genuine horror, finally realizing the magnitude of the federal crimes he had committed. I sat perfectly still, watching my family realize that the cage they had built for me had just snapped shut around them. Judge Caldwell stared at the single sheet of paper in Evelyn Sterling's hand, as if it had suddenly caught fire. He slowly removed his glasses and directed a gaze of absolute Arctic fury toward the petitioner table. He demanded that Harrison immediately explain the origin of the offshore funds and the undeniable financial link to his star medical witness. Harrison stumbled backwards, completely losing his polished courtroom swagger. He frantically shuffled through his pristine legal notepads, stuttering and attempting to claim that he had zero prior knowledge of his client's private financial disbursements. He tried to pivot back to my medical history, desperately insisting that the psychiatric evaluation still held merit regardless of any alleged consulting fees paid to the doctor. Evelyn did not even let him finish his pathetic sentence. She did not waste a single breath defending my sanity or addressing the fabricated claims about my mental decline. She knew that defending a lie only gives it oxygen. Instead, she pivoted entirely to a full-scale frontal assault on Trent's credibility. She snapped her fingers, and her junior partner instantly connected a secure encrypted tablet to the courtroom's digital overhead projector. A massive high-resolution spreadsheet illuminated the blank white wall behind the judge's bench. Evelyn stepped to the center of the floor and systematically dismantled my brother. She calmly explained to the court that while Richard had attempted to launder the bulk of the bribe through a Cayman Islands holding account, Trent had made a desperately sloppy fatal error. He had panicked, needing to secure Dr. Thorne's signature immediately to meet the emergency filing deadline. Evelyn tapped a laser pointer against the projected screen, highlighting a specific row. She revealed a direct, untraceable $20,000 wire transfer originating from a Shell LLC solely owned and operated by Trent. The destination account was unequivocally registered to Dr. Eris Thorne's personal banking portfolio. Evelyn read the timestamp aloud, emphasizing every syllable. The transfer was executed exactly 48 hours before the fraudulent medical affidavit was signed and notarized. Trent had explicitly labeled the massive wire transfer as an expedited medical consultation bonus. Trent slumped forward, burying his face in his hands as his corporate execution was broadcast in 10-foot-high letters for the entire gallery to witness. He had weaponized my past trauma, but he had left a glaring digital paper trail of his own felonies. Harrison practically lunged across the petitioner table, shouting a frantic legal objection. He aggressively argued that the banking records were obtained without a proper subpoena and violated strict financial privacy laws. He demanded that the judge strike the projection from the official record and sanction my legal team for presenting inadmissible evidence. Judge Caldwell slammed his heavy wooden gavel down with enough force to echo off the marble columns. He leaned over the elevated bench, his face flushed with unadulterated outrage. He ruthlessly silenced Harrison, ordering him to stand down immediately or face immediate incarceration for contempt of court. The judge stated that the court had an absolute zero-tolerance policy for medical perjury and judicial manipulation. Judge Caldwell's voice echoed with righteous authority as he verbally eviscerated the petitioner table. He declared that he had sat on the bench for 30 years and had never witnessed such a vile, calculated abuse of the conservatorship process. He explicitly stated that attempting to strip a competent, independent woman of her civil liberties through bribery and medical fraud was a sickening perversion of the justice system. Without a second of hesitation, Judge Caldwell threw out the emergency conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice. He legally barred Trent or any member of my family from ever filing a similar injunction against me in his jurisdiction again. But he was not finished. The judge turned his blazing focus directly onto Harrison. He officially sanctioned the high-priced corporate lawyer and his entire firm for failing to conduct basic due diligence and presenting a perjured affidavit to the Supreme Court. He ordered them to pay all of my exorbitant legal fees incurred by Vanguard and Sterling. Harrison looked as though he were going to be physically sick, clutching his briefcase, as his professional reputation was publicly incinerated. Then Judge Caldwell delivered the final, devastating blow. He instructed the court bailiff to immediately confiscate the projected financial documents and the sworn medical affidavit. He looked directly at my parents and my brother, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. He officially announced from the bench that he was permanently impounding the evidence and forwarding the entire unredacted transcript of this hearing directly to the district attorney's office. He explicitly recommended that federal prosecutors open an immediate criminal investigation into Richard Trent and Dr. Eris Thorne for felony bribery, aggravated perjury, and criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. The mention of the district attorney's office and federal prosecutors completely broke the remaining facade of my family. The realization that they were no longer facing a simple civil dispute, but actual decades in federal prison hit them like a freight train. Patricia began hyperventilating violently, her chest heaving as she stared at the courtroom doors. The aristocratic, poised matriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified woman, facing the total destruction of her luxurious, comfortable life. She could not handle the public humiliation. She could not stomach the reality of criminal charges. Patricia violently shoved her chair back, grabbed her designer handbag, and bolted. She practically ran down the center aisle of the courtroom, fleeing the scene of her crime in utter disgrace. Richard did not attempt to stop her or defend his son. He took one look at the furious judge, one look at the irrefutable banking records projected on the wall, and completely abandoned his golden boy. He scrambled out of his chair and sprinted after his wife, leaving Trent entirely isolated at the petitioner table. Trent sat utterly alone, his multi-million-dollar smart city project in ruins, his legal shield shattered and criminal charges looming over his head. I sat perfectly still beside my attorneys, watching him slowly realize that his corporate empire was officially dead. Trent stumbled out of the state Supreme Court. A broken man, but a cornered predator is always the most dangerous. The threat of federal prison was terrifying, but the immediate danger was far worse. His offshore investors, the dark money syndicate financing the $500 million Smart City project, did not care about Judge Caldwell or the district attorney. They cared about their return on investment. Trent had guaranteed them clear title to the entire commercial block by the end of the week. They had explicitly warned him that failure was not an option, and their collection methods were infinitely more brutal than any white-collar prison sentence. He had exactly 12 hours to secure the land, or he was a dead man. The legal system was completely sealed off to him. The judge had frozen his assets and permanently barred him from contesting the property lines in court. Trent retreated to his penthouse office, locking the heavy glass doors and pulling the blinds. He paced the floor, his mind racing through increasingly manic scenarios. He needed to physically erase the Apex packaging warehouse. If the building was reduced to a pile of pulverized brick and twisted steel before sunrise, the historical landmark application would instantly vaporize. You cannot protect a building that no longer exists. Once the structure was gone, the subterranean infrastructure rights would be exposed, and he could force the development through sheer momentum. He just needed a demolition crew willing to ask no questions and a municipal official corrupt enough to greenlight an illegal teardown. Both of those things required immediate, untraceable liquid cash. Trent logged into the secure family server. His personal accounts were heavily monitored, but the primary family trust was still active. Richard and Patricia were currently barricaded in their country estate, avoiding the media firestorm, completely unaware of the digital backdoor Trent had installed in their private network years ago. Trent pulled up a blank authorization form for Patricia private equity reserves. His mother had millions sitting in a high-yield account designed for emergency acquisitions. Trent's hands shook as he manipulated the digital PDF. He had spent years watching his mother sign documents, and he knew her flowing, elegant signature perfectly. He flawlessly forged Patricia's signature on the trust transfer, executing a massive unauthorized withdrawal. He bypassed the standard banking protocols and routed the stolen funds directly into a municipal lobbying slush fund. With the cash secured, Trent picked up his burner phone and dialed a very specific unlisted number. He bypassed his usual corporate fixers and reached out to a corrupt city zoning commissioner who had been on his unofficial payroll for years. Trent demanded an immediate off-the-books demolition order for the Apex property. The commissioner initially refused, citing the massive media attention and the Supreme Court injunction. Trent did not argue. He simply transferred $500,000 of Patricia's stolen money directly into the commissioner offshore crypto wallet. The digital bribe worked instantly. The commissioner agreed to issue a backdated emergency hazard demolition permit, claiming the warehouse posed an immediate threat to public safety. He promised Trent that a private non-union wrecking crew would be staged and ready to roll by 4 in the morning. Abigail sat at her kitchen island, staring out the window at the quiet city skyline. The adrenaline from the courtroom victory was slowly beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. Evelyn Sterling and her legal team had successfully paralyzed Trent corporate machine, but Abigail knew her brother too well. The silence felt wrong. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that always preceded a catastrophic storm. She kept her laptop open continuously, monitoring the security cameras she had recently installed around the perimeter of the Apex warehouse. The feeds showed nothing but empty sidewalks and flickering streetlights. At exactly 2 in the morning, her encrypted mobile phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. Abigail jolted awake, grabbing the device. The incoming message was from a masked international number. She unlocked the screen and opened the text. A single high-resolution photograph loaded on the display. It was a digital scan of a municipal document. Abigail zoomed in on the harsh black text, her heart slamming against her ribs. It was an official city demolition order authorizing the immediate leveling of the Apex packaging facility. The document was stamped with an emergency hazard seal and signed by the city zoning commissioner. The execution time was set for dawn. A second message appeared beneath the photograph. The text was incredibly concise, delivering tactical information with surgical precision. The message warned her that Trent had bypassed the court entirely and bribed the zoning office. It stated that 3 heavy bulldozers and a private wrecking crew were currently staging in an abandoned lot exactly 2 blocks east of her property. The sender advised her that the police would not respond to property disputes without a judge present, and by the time the courts opened at 9, the building would be nothing but dust. Abigail stared at the glowing screen, her mind rapidly processing the impending destruction. The anonymous sender had just handed her the exact intelligence she needed to save her property, but she needed to know who was feeding her this critical insider information. A third and final message materialized on the screen. It did not contain a name, but it contained a detail so specific it immediately identified the source. The message simply read that a ruthless street prosecutor never leaves a job half-finished. Abigail smiled a sharp, dangerous smile in the dark kitchen. Jasmine. Trent's brilliant discarded wife had not just walked away from the family. She had stayed embedded in the shadows, monitoring Trent encrypted communications and waiting for the perfect moment to twist the knife. Jasmine was feeding her the tactical coordinates to completely destroy her ex-husband. Abigail grabbed her keys, her heavy coat, and her legal briefcase. She had less than 2 hours to stop a fleet of bulldozers, and she was not about to let Trent turn her legacy into rubble. The freezing pre-dawn air vibrated with the deep guttural roar of heavy diesel engines. At exactly 6 in the morning, a convoy of unauthorized private demolition equipment rolled onto the cracked asphalt of the industrial district. 3 massive yellow bulldozers and a heavy-duty excavator lumbered toward the perimeter of the Apex packaging warehouse. The thick steel treads chewed up the frost-covered pavement, leaving brutal scars in their wake. Trent stood safely on the opposite sidewalk, leaning casually against the sleek hood of his black sports car. He held a steaming cup of artisan coffee, wrapped his camel hair coat tightly around his shoulders, and smiled. It was a cold, predatory smirk. He watched the heavy machinery align itself along the property boundary, relishing the absolute destruction he was about to unleash. In his mind, the Supreme Court disaster was already ancient history. You cannot preserve a historic landmark if it is reduced to a smoking crater of pulverized brick and twisted rebar. When the anonymous text message from Jasmine had illuminated Abigail Kitchen in the dead of night, she had not panicked. She had immediately forwarded the forged demolition permit and the staging coordinates directly to Evelyn Sterling. A senior partner at Vanguard and Sterling did not sleep when a client multi-million-dollar asset was under imminent threat. Evelyn had woken up a federal district judge at 4 a.m, leveraging the massive offshore wire fraud evidence they had presented at the Supreme Court just hours earlier. The federal judge, enraged by Trent's blatant attempt to circumvent the state judicial ruling and destroy evidence of his crimes, had issued an emergency federal stay, immediately overriding any local municipal orders. Armed with the ultimate legal shield, Abigail had driven to the warehouse and waited in the freezing darkness for her brother to arrive. A sleek silver SUV glided to a halt right behind Trent's car. The heavy doors opened and Richard and Patricia stepped out into the freezing dawn. They looked exhausted but deeply relieved. They had fled the Supreme Court in utter disgrace, but Trent had promised them a permanent, brutal solution. They huddled together on the sidewalk, pulling their designer coats tight against the wind, eager to witness the physical erasure of my defiance. Patricia clutched Richard's arms, staring at the towering brick facade of the warehouse with pure, unadulterated hatred. She wanted the building gone. She wanted my independence crushed under thousands of tons of concrete so the family could finally reclaim control of the narrative. The demolition foreman, a burly man wearing a stained high-visibility vest and a hard hat, hopped down from the lead bulldozer. He jogged over to Trent, holding a clipboard with the forged emergency hazard permit. The foreman looked uneasy. He pointed a thick, calloused finger toward the warehouse, highlighting the newly installed security cameras and the clear signs of occupation. He told Trent that the building did not look abandoned. He warned that initiating a teardown with a potential occupant inside was a massive liability, even with a municipal hazard permit. Trent rolled his eyes and took a slow, arrogant sip of his coffee. He stepped right into the foreman's personal space, his voice dripping with condescension. Trent explicitly ordered the man to start the teardown immediately. He lied effortlessly, claiming that the only person inside was a deranged squatter, a mentally incompetent relative who had illegally breached the perimeter. Trent laughed, a sharp, callous sound. He told the foreman that the crazy woman would run out the back door like a frightened rat the second the bulldozer blade struck the front masonry. He reminded the foreman of the massive, off-the-books cash bonus sitting in his account and demanded that the building be leveled before the sun fully breached the horizon. The foreman hesitated for one brief second before greed completely overrode his professional caution. He nodded sharply, turned around, and signaled to the operators. The operators engaged the throttles. The roaring of the 3 bulldozers escalated into a deafening, synchronized howl. Plumes of thick black exhaust smoke shot into the pale morning sky. The massive steel blades were lowered until they scraped against the pavement, sending sparks flying into the chilly air. The lead bulldozer lurched forward, shifting into gear, bearing down directly on the historic loading dock doors. Trent laughed out loud, throwing his head back in pure arrogant triumph. Richard and Patricia stepped closer to the curb, their eyes wide with manic anticipation. The heavy steel treads clanked relentlessly, shaking the ground beneath their feet as the machine closed the distance. The heavy metal front doors of the warehouse suddenly groaned and swung wide open. I stepped out of the shadows and straight into the freezing dawn light. I was not wearing pajamas. I was not holding a cardboard protest sign. I was not screaming or crying or begging them to stop. I wore a sharply tailored navy blue trench coat over a pristine white silk blouse, my hair pinned back in an immaculate twist. I walked down the concrete loading ramp with the absolute terrifying composure of a woman who held every single card in the deck. I did not flinch as the deafening roar of the bulldozer engine vibrated through my chest. I walked straight out onto the asphalt and planted myself directly in the path of the massive yellow machine. The operator saw me and panicked. He slammed both boots onto the heavy air brakes. The bulldozer shrieked in protest, the massive steel treads locking up and skidding across the frosted pavement. The heavy machine violently jerked to a halt, stopping less than 5 feet from where I stood, perfectly still. The sudden silence that followed the engine cut off was deafening. Trent dropped his coffee. The ceramic cup shattered against the sidewalk, sending dark liquid splashing across his expensive Italian leather shoes. He lunged forward, screaming at the foreman. He pointed wildly at me, demanding that the crew physically remove me from the premises and proceed with the demolition. He shrieked that I had no legal right to be there, that the municipal hazard order superseded my ownership. I ignored my brother completely. I did not even look at his panic-stricken face. I calmly unlatched the heavy brass lock of my leather briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a thick document bound in heavy blue cardstock. It was not a municipal permit. It was not a local city ordinance. I held the document up high so the foreman and the operators could see the undeniable, shimmering gold seal of the United States Federal Court. I looked directly at the foreman and informed him that the paper he was holding was a forged document purchased with stolen family trust funds. I then informed him that the document I was holding was a federal injunction signed exactly 30 minutes prior by a federal district judge. I explicitly stated that the injunction mandated the immediate and total cessation of all physical activity on the Apex property. I locked eyes with the terrified demolition crew and warned them that if a single piece of heavy machinery touched one brick of my building, they would not be facing local zoning fines. They would be facing immediate federal arrest for violating a direct order from a United States District Court judge. The foreman went entirely pale. He looked from the federal seal in my hand to the manic, screaming mess that my brother had become on the sidewalk. The foreman knew instantly that he had been played. He turned around, raised his hands in a swift, sharp motion, and ordered his crew to kill the engines. Trent screamed in absolute, unfiltered rage. He lunged off the curb, charging toward the property line, but Richard grabbed the back of his coat, hauling him backward. Richard had recognized the blue backing of the federal document. The patriarch of the family finally understood that his son had bypassed the local corruption network and triggered a massive federal tripwire. Patricia covered her mouth with both hands, staggering backward as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. I lowered the federal injunction and finally turned my gaze toward the sidewalk. I looked at Trent, staring at the pathetic, shattered remains of his corporate ambition. He had tried to bury my legacy under thousands of tons of concrete, but all he had done was dig his own permanent grave. The silence lasted only a fraction of a second before Trent completely lost whatever remained of his sanity. He lunged off the curb, waving his arms frantically at the foreman. The heavy scent of diesel exhaust hung in the freezing air, mixing with the raw smell of his desperation. He screamed that the federal seal was a cheap counterfeit printed off the internet. He ordered the operators to start the engines back up, promising to double their off-the-books bonus if they drove the massive steel blades through the front doors immediately. He grabbed the foreman by the shoulder of his reflective vest, violently shaking the larger man while demanding compliance. The foreman simply shoved my brother backward, stepping away from the machinery and raising his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. No amount of illicit cash was worth crossing a federal judge. While Trent continued his manic tirade, a sleek black town car glided silently down the frost-covered street. It parked directly behind the line of stationary yellow bulldozers blocking their only exit route. The heavy tinted door swung open, and Jasmine stepped onto the cracked asphalt. She looked flawless. She wore a sharp crimson trench coat over a tailored black suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate bun. She did not look like a discarded wife or a heartbroken victim of marital neglect. She looked like an apex predator arriving to survey her kill. The sharp click of her stiletto heels on the frozen pavement cut through the chilly morning air, drawing everyone's attention. Trent froze mid-scream. He turned around, his mouth hanging open as he watched the woman he had underestimated for years walk directly past him. He reached out a trembling hand as if to stop her, but she did not even blink in his direction. She walked straight up the concrete loading ramp and took her place firmly at my side. Trent stared at us, his eyes darting frantically between his estranged wife and his targeted sister. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The two women he had spent his entire life successfully manipulating, marginalizing, and dismissing were now standing shoulder to shoulder, holding the absolute power to dismantle his entire existence. Jasmine did not raise her voice. She spoke with the chilling, calculated precision of a seasoned prosecutor addressing a hostile witness. She looked directly at Trent and announced that she was the anonymous source who provided the offshore wire transfer coordinates to my legal team. She stated clearly that she had spent the last 8 months quietly monitoring his encrypted corporate communications, gathering a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence detailing his massive network of municipal bribery and racketeering. Richard stepped forward from the sidewalk, his face a mask of aristocratic outrage. He demanded to know how Jasmine had bypassed the secure family network protocols. He accused her of corporate espionage and threatened to bury her in endless civil litigation, claiming she had violated her marital non-disclosure agreements. Jasmine turned her icy gaze toward my father and smiled a dangerously sharp smile. She informed Richard that she did not need to hack the highly classified family network because Trent had foolishly left his administrative access open on his home office terminal. She explained that Trent's arrogance had blinded him to the fact that his wife was a highly trained legal professional who knew exactly how to track illicit funds across international borders. But she was not finished. She had saved the most devastating revelation for last. Jasmine turned her attention to Patricia, who was still shivering on the sidewalk, clutching her designer coat against the biting wind. Jasmine reached into her leather portfolio and extracted a certified banking document highlighting a block of financial routing numbers. She held it up, announcing that while Trent had used his own shell companies to bribe the corrupt psychiatrist, he had run out of liquid capital to secure the demolition permit. She stated that just 3 hours ago, Trent had electronically forged Patricia's signature on a highly restricted family trust document. He had illegally withdrawn $500,000 from Patricia private equity reserves, routing it directly to the zoning commissioner offshore crypto wallet to pay for the unrecorded demolition order. Patricia's face drained of all color, turning an ashen, sickly gray. She stared at Trent, her eyes wide with absolute horror. The realization that her golden boy had not only committed federal crimes, but had directly stolen from her personal emergency funds shattered her entire worldview. She had spent decades protecting him, enabling his worst behavior, and covering up his catastrophic mistakes. She had conspired to lock her own daughter in a psychiatric ward just to ensure Trent's success. In return, he had plundered her private accounts to cover his own corrupt tracks. Trent backed away, stumbling over the curb and shaking his head wildly. He stammered out pathetic excuses, claiming he was going to replenish the trust as soon as the smart city investors paid out the massive development bonus. He pleaded with his mother, claiming he only forged her signature to save the family legacy from my supposed incompetence. He begged Richard to call their corporate bankers to authorize a reverse transfer to fix the missing funds. Jasmine cut off his frantic apologies with a voice like shattering glass. She announced that she had not only provided me with the evidence for the federal injunction, but she had already forwarded the completely unredacted financial logs, including the forged trust withdrawal, directly to the District Attorney Fraud Division. She explicitly stated that the Municipal Bribery Task Force was currently securing warrants for Trent Penthouse Office, his corporate servers, and all of Richard holding companies. The entire financial infrastructure of the family was about to be seized by federal investigators. Patricia completely lost her carefully maintained high society composure. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at Jasmine, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek echoing off the brick walls of the warehouse. She screamed that Jasmine was a disgusting traitor. She yelled that Jasmine had married into a prominent family, only to tear it apart from the inside out. She demanded to know how a daughter-in-law could be so vindictive and ruthless toward the people who had graciously welcomed her into their elite social circle. Jasmine stood tall on the loading dock, perfectly framed by the towering historical facade of the warehouse Trent had tried to destroy. She did not flinch at the hysterical screaming. She did not show a single ounce of intimidation. She looked down at her mother-in-law, with eyes like polished obsidian, radiating absolute authority. "I am an officer of the court before I am your daughter-in-law, and your son is going to federal prison 48 hours later, the atmosphere inside the 85th floor boardroom of the Silicon Vista corporate headquarters was suffocatingly thick. The air conditioning was running at full blast, yet Trent was sweating profusely. He stood at the head of a massive marble conference table, gripping a digital laser pointer so tightly his knuckles were completely white. This was his final stand, the absolute last chance to secure the $500 million funding package from the offshore investment syndicate before the federal indictments inevitably dropped. Richard and Patricia sat rigidly in the front row of the gallery chairs. They had spent the last 2 days living in a state of absolute, unadulterated terror. Jasmine had not been bluffing. The district attorney had already frozen their primary holding accounts, and federal agents had been seen circling their country estate. Yet here they were desperately attempting to project the ultimate image of untouchable corporate aristocracy. Patricia wore a stark white designer suit, her face pulled taut into a brittle, agonizingly fake smile. Richard sat with his legs crossed, attempting to look relaxed, but his eyes darted nervously toward the boardroom doors every few seconds. They knew that if Trent failed to close this deal today, the dangerous men sitting at the conference table would not bother filing a lawsuit. They would simply destroy him. The investors were not standard venture capitalists. They were a shadowy consortium of international billionaires who demanded absolute perfection and zero legal liabilities. The lead investor, a man named Klaus, sat at the center of the table with his hands steeped, resting his chin on his fingertips. His cold, dead eyes tracked Trent's every movement. Trent swallowed hard, forcing a surge of manufactured enthusiasm into his voice. He clicked his remote and a massive holographic projection illuminated the center of the dark room. It displayed the proposed Silicon Vista smart city, a sprawling, futuristic metropolis of glass and steel. Trent began his pitch, focusing heavily on the project crown jewel. He loudly touted their revolutionary eco-polymer insulation technology designed to make the entire city entirely energy independent. He paced back and forth, his voice echoing off the acoustic panels. He explained that the eco-polymer structures required massive subterranean cooling grids to regulate the intense heat generated by the underground data centers. Trent pointed his laser directly at the digital map, highlighting a massive underground network of pipes and ventilation shafts. He lied through his teeth with the desperate fervor of a cornered animal. He assured the syndicate that the land for the cooling grids was entirely secured and that the subterranean infrastructure rights were fully owned by their holding company. Trent knew he was committing massive financial fraud in real time. The brilliant glowing blue lines of the subterranean cooling grids on his digital map ran directly underneath the footprint of the Apex packaging warehouse, the warehouse he had failed to demolish, the warehouse Abigail completely owned. Without Abigail land, the cooling grids could not be built. Without the cooling grids, the eco-polymer buildings would literally melt from the thermal output of the servers. The entire $500 million project was a worthless fantasy without her property. But Klaus did not know that. The billionaire consortium had not been informed of the Supreme Court disaster or the federal injunction. Trent had successfully quarantined the local media fallout, relying on his remaining corrupt contacts to scrub the financial blogs. He was gambling his life on the hope that he could get Klaus to sign the term sheets, secure the initial transfer of funds, and flee the country before the syndicate realized they had bought a legally paralyzed project. Trent finished his pitch with a dramatic sweeping gesture. He promised unprecedented returns on their investment and guaranteed that construction would break ground by the end of the month. He looked at Klaus, his chest heaving, his tailored shirt completely soaked with nervous sweat. Klaus stared at the holographic map for a long, silent moment. The tension in the room was so heavy it felt like it could shatter the reinforced glass windows. Finally, Klaus gave a slow, deliberate nod. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold Mont Blanc fountain pen. He pulled the thick stack of binding term sheets toward him, adjusting his reading glasses. Richard let out a shaky breath of relief. Patricia closed her eyes briefly, thanking whatever dark deity had allowed them to survive this nightmare. Trent allowed a manic, triumphant grin to stretch across his face. He was going to get away with it. He was going to take the money and run, leaving Abigail to deal with the fallout of the federal investigations. Klaus uncapped his pen and lowered the gold nib toward the signature line on the $500 million contract. A massive, deafening crash echoed through the room as the heavy, solid mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom were violently shoved open. The sound was so sudden and violent that Klaus dropped his pen, sending black ink splattering across the pristine white contract. Two massive private security guards hired by Trent specifically to keep the floor locked down stumbled backward into the room. They had been physically overpowered. A team of broad-shouldered men in dark suits pushed the guards aside, securing the entrance with aggressive military precision. Trent froze, his triumphant smile instantly dying on his face. Richard vaulted out of his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. Patricia gasped, gripping the armrests of her seat with white-knuckled panic. Abigail strode into the boardroom. She did not look like the fragile victim they had tried to lock in a psychiatric ward. She did not look like the desperate sister begging for her inheritance. She looked like absolute unyielding corporate death. She wore a striking blood-red blazer over a charcoal dress, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Her expression was completely devoid of emotion, radiating the cold, calculated dominance of a woman who was about to burn an empire to ash. Evelyn Sterling and her team of elite corporate litigators walked closely behind her, carrying thick leather briefcases and projecting absolute untouchable authority. Security scrambled, attempting to block the aisle, but Evelyn simply flashed a badge and a federal document, forcing the guards to step back immediately. Abigail walked straight past her terrified parents. She ignored her brother completely. She marched directly up to the massive marble table, stopping right in front of Klaus and the billionaire syndicate. She placed her hands flat on the polished stone, looking down at the ruined contract and the terrified men who were about to fund her brother escape. Trent shattered the suffocating tension of the boardroom with a shrill, frantic shout. He pointed a trembling finger at Abigail, his face flushed an ugly mottled crimson. He demanded that the remaining private security guards physically drag her out of the executive suite immediately. He labeled her a corporate spy, a deranged former employee, and an unhinged trespasser. He slammed his fist against the polished marble tabletop, ordering the men in dark suits to forcefully remove the hostile threat from the premises. He was bleeding confident, sweating profusely through his bespoke collar, entirely unhinged in front of the most powerful financial syndicate on the continent. The investors watched his meltdown with growing distaste. Billionaires do not invest $500 million with men who cannot control their own boardrooms. The private security guards hesitated, stepping forward to grab Abigail by the arms. Before they could make physical contact, a single sharp voice cut through the chaotic room. Klaus raised one impeccably manicured hand. The lead billionaire investor did not look at Trent. He kept his cold, calculating gaze locked entirely on Abigail. Klaus remembered her perfectly from their brief, intense encounter at the downtown restaurant weeks prior. He remembered her razor-sharp intellect, the unyielding composure she had displayed, and the distinct financial warning she had subtly woven into their polite conversation. Klaus was a man who had built international empires by identifying both highly profitable opportunities and catastrophic hidden liabilities. Trent, manic sweating and desperate shouting, screamed of massive, unmitigated liabilities. Klaus flicked his wrist and issued a quiet, absolute command. He ordered the security personnel to stand down, step back, and let the woman speak. The guards instantly retreated, backing against the expensive oak-paneled walls. Trent's mouth fell open, a strangled sound escaping his throat as his ultimate corporate authority was stripped away in his own headquarters. Abigail did not thank Klaus. She simply offered him a brief, knowing nod, acknowledging the sudden shift in the power dynamic. She bypassed the frantic, hyperventilating mess of her brother and began her slow, deliberate walk to the absolute head of the massive glass conference table. To get to the front of the room, she had to walk directly past Richard and Patricia. The patriarch and matriarch of the family were practically shrinking into the expensive leather upholstery of their front-row gallery chairs. Patricia's pristine white designer suit suddenly looked like a flag of surrender. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide and darting frantically, searching the room for an escape route that did not exist. She clutched her luxury handbag against her chest, as if it could somehow shield her from the impending public ruin. Richard gripped his leather folio, his knuckles completely white, his jaw clenched tight with the sudden terrifying realization that his golden child was entirely incompetent. For decades, Richard and Patricia had meticulously curated an illusion of absolute superiority, casting Abigail as the defective, ungrateful scapegoat. They had starved her of affection, dismissed her brilliance, and gladly sacrificed her future just to pave the way for Trent ascension. They had manipulated every family narrative to ensure their son remained the undisputed heir to their corporate throne. Now they were forced to watch in paralyzed, terrified silence as the daughter they had discarded systematically dismantled their fraudulent legacy piece by piece. Abigail paused for a fraction of a second, looking down at her parents. She offered them no anger and no tears. She offered them only cold, absolute pity, before turning her gaze forward and leaving them behind in the wreckage of their own making. Abigail reached the head of the conference table. Trent scrambled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished hardwood floor until his spine hit the digital projection screen. The holographic map of his fraudulent smart city illuminated his terrified face in a sickly, artificial blue light. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with the primal terror of a predator suddenly realizing it had become the hunted prey. He tried to speak, to spin another desperate lie to assert his fading dominance, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man stripped of his stolen resources and family protection. Abigail simply looked at him. She stood tall, her posture impeccable, radiating a terrifying, serene dominance. She had spent her entire life shrinking herself, modifying her ambition and hiding her intellect just to make Trent look bigger. She was completely done shrinking. She claimed the boardroom, pulling all the oxygen and authority into her own orbit. She did not need to raise her voice or throw a tantrum to command respect. Her silent, unyielding presence was enough to paralyze her brother and captivate the billionaire syndicate. Evelyn Sterling stepped up quietly beside Abigail, moving with the practiced efficiency of a master litigator. Evelyn handed her the devastating ammunition they had meticulously prepared over the last 72 hours. Abigail took the delivery smoothly. She raised both hands high, gripping two massive leather-bound legal dossiers. The heavy binders contained the irrefutable hard evidence of offshore wire fraud, forged municipal demolition permits, faked environmental impact studies, and the stolen architectural patents that formed the entire foundational premise of the Silicon Vista project. Every single lie Trent had told was thoroughly documented, indexed, and proven false within those pages. With a swift, forceful motion, Abigail dropped the two massive dossiers onto the exact center of the polished glass table. The heavy thud echoed through the silent boardroom like the slam of a judge gavel. Abigail locked eyes with Klaus and the rest of the billionaire investor syndicate. She delivered her opening statement with surgical, devastating precision. "Gentlemen," she addressed the board, her voice clear and ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Before you sign those checks, you should know that you are funding a project built entirely on stolen property and stolen intellectual rights." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Klaus did not blink. He slowly leaned back in his leather executive chair, steepling his fingers once more. He gestured toward the digital projection screen at the front of the room, granting Abigail complete control of the floor. Evelyn Sterling stepped forward with practiced efficiency. She bypassed the sweating, paralyzed form of my brother and plugged an encrypted flash drive directly into the central console of the boardroom. The sleek, glowing holographic models of Trent futuristic eco-polymer smart city instantly vanished. The colorful spinning graphics were immediately replaced by stark high-resolution scans of heavily faded black and white architectural blueprints. Abigail opened the first leather-bound dossier and flipped to a page marked with a red tag. She looked around the table, making deliberate eye contact with every single billionaire in the syndicate. She informed them that they were looking at the original 1950s municipal schematics for the Apex packaging warehouse, and the surrounding industrial district. Trent finally found his voice, his pitch rising in a desperate, panicked squeak. He tried to interrupt, insisting that those blueprints were 70 years out of date and completely irrelevant to modern municipal zoning codes. Klaus did not even look at Trent. He simply raised one hand and delivered a single sharp command, ordering my brother to sit down and remain entirely silent. Trent collapsed into the nearest chair, as if the strings holding him up had been suddenly severed. Abigail picked up the digital laser pointer that Trent had dropped on the table. She activated the beam and directed it at the projection screen. She pressed a button on the console overlaying Trent multi-million-dollar Silicon Vista infrastructure grid directly on top of the 1950s warehouse blueprints. The room let out a collective sharp intake of breath. The visual overlap was catastrophic. Abigail traced the bright red lines of Trent's proposed subterranean cooling grids, showing exactly how they intersected with the deep foundation of her building. She explained with surgical precision that the massive ecopolymer structures Trent was pitching generated immense amounts of thermal output. To prevent those buildings from literally melting down from the inside out, they required a massive state-of-the-art underground cooling network. She moved the laser pointer, tracing a series of thick blue lines representing the primary municipal water mains and the only viable high-voltage electrical substation access for the entire district. Every single one of those critical utility lines ran directly beneath the subterranean levels of the Apex property. Trent had designed his entire $500 million smart city around a central hub of utilities that he did not own and could not legally access. Richard shot out of his seat, his face purple with rage and embarrassment. He pointed at the screen, shouting that municipal utility easements allowed developers to route infrastructure under existing properties. He claimed the city would grant them eminent domain access within a week. He was desperately trying to save the deal, relying on the old rules of corporate bullying. Evelyn Sterling slammed a heavy certified document onto the glass table directly in front of Richard. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Evelyn informed my father that his outdated understanding of property law was exactly why Vanguard and Sterling was dismantling his empire. She explained that the Apex packaging warehouse held absolute grandfathered property rights. Abigail took over seamlessly. She detailed how the original deed to the warehouse, drafted before modern municipal zoning laws were established, granted the property owner unbroken and absolute subterranean rights extending straight down to the bedrock. The city possessed no utility easements on her land. The state could not claim eminent domain over a historically protected landmark, with a standing federal injunction defending it. Trent had assumed he could rely on corrupt zoning commissioners to illegally bulldoze the building and rewrite the property lines after the fact. He had built his entire financial model on the assumption of a successful illegal demolition. Abigail walked slowly down the length of the glass table, her eyes locked on Klaus. She delivered the final devastating blow with perfect, chilling clarity. She informed the billionaire syndicate that without her express legally notarized signature granting them access to the bedrock beneath her warehouse, the Silicon Vista project was a dead piece of land. She spelled it out so there could be no misunderstanding. She told them that Trent futuristic ecopolymer smart city literally could not have running water. It could not have centralized air conditioning. It could not even connect to the municipal electrical grid to turn on the lights. Trent had asked them for $500 million to build a technologically advanced oven that would suffocate its own tenants. The boardroom erupted into furious, localized chaos. The polished billionaire investors lost their calm facades entirely. They began muttering angrily to one another, violently flipping through their printed copies of Trent due diligence reports. They pointed at the forged hazard permits and the faked environmental impact studies that Evelyn Sterling's team was currently distributing around the table. The lead investor from Dubai slammed his fist onto the table, demanding to know how Trent had hidden this massive infrastructure bottleneck. The representative from the European banking conglomerate threw his pen across the room, shouting that they had been intentionally defrauded. They realized with terrifying clarity that Trent had lied directly to their faces during every single phase of the due diligence process. He had promised them clear title and unrestricted developmental rights while knowing full well that a hostile party held the absolute physical chokehold over the entire district. Klaus remained seated at the head of the table. He did not yell. He did not throw his paperwork. His reaction was far more dangerous. His face turned to stone, his eyes narrowing into cold, lethal slits. He looked at Trent, not as a business partner, but as a liability that needed to be surgically removed. Klaus realized that Trent had nearly tricked him into wiring hundreds of millions of dollars into a project that was legally paralyzed by a federal court order and physically blocked by a piece of untouchable historic real estate. The syndicate had been played for fools by an arrogant, desperate heir who thought he could outsmart the international market. The tension in the room shifted from corporate annoyance to a dark, simmering threat of absolute financial vengeance. Trent broke the heavy silence with a high-pitched, nervous laugh. He waved his trembling hands in the air, desperately trying to physically wave away the catastrophic evidence sitting on the table. He stammered that the subterranean land rights were nothing more than a minor logistical hurdle. He assured Klaus and the syndicate that his engineering team could easily reroute the cooling grids around the warehouse. He promised they would dig deeper, bypass the foundation, and find a secondary access point for the electrical substation. He lied with reckless abandon, completely ignoring the basic laws of physics and municipal engineering. Klaus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the marble table. His voice was a dangerous, quiet rumble. He asked Trent how exactly one reroutes a massive centralized thermal cooling system through solid granite bedrock without doubling the entire project budget and delaying construction by a decade. Trent opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked to his father for help. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn Sterling fixed him with a stare so icy he instantly snapped his jaw shut. The patriarch realized that any word he spoke would only implicate him further in the fraud. Abigail did not waste a single breath arguing with her brother about the land. The land was a steel trap that had already snapped shut. She immediately reached for the second massive leather-bound dossier. She flipped the heavy cover open and pressed a button on the digital console. The holographic display above the table shifted instantly. The blue glowing maps of the subterranean city grid vanished. In their place, a stark scanned image of a highly technical legal document illuminated the room. It was dense with chemical formulas, engineering diagrams, and dense legal jargon. The date stamped at the top of the filing was clearly visible. It was exactly 15 years old. Trent looked up at the screen and physically stumbled backward. His knees hit a leather chair and he collapsed into it, his chest heaving. All the remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He recognized the document immediately. He thought he had buried it forever. Abigail walked slowly around the edge of the table, keeping her eyes locked on the billionaire investors. She asked the syndicate to recall the absolute crown jewel of the Silicon Vista smart city. She reminded them of the proprietary technology that Trent had used to justify their massive $500 million valuation. She pointed her laser directly at the center of the projected document. It was the eco-polymer insulation, the revolutionary material designed to make the entire city energy independent. Trent had pitched it to the world as a breakthrough innovation developed entirely by Silicon Vista internal research and development team. He claimed it was a modern marvel of his own creation. Abigail shattered that lie with surgical precision. She explained that the brilliant ecopolymer formula was not a modern marvel at all. It was developed 15 years ago by the original founder of Apex Packaging. The founder was not just a warehouse operator, but a brilliant materials engineer who had created the exact chemical compound to insulate temperature-sensitive industrial shipping containers. When Apex Packaging suffered its devastating financial collapse and went into liquidation, the patent was lost in the chaos. It was locked away and forgotten inside a rusted safe in the back storage room of the abandoned warehouse. Abigail explained that Trent had found it during his initial scouting of the property. Instead of reporting the asset, he had stolen the formula, tweaked a few inconsequential variables, and rebranded it as his own proprietary smart city technology. Trent had bet his entire future on the assumption that a bankrupt dead company could not sue him for theft. Patricia gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Her perfect facade was completely destroyed as the sheer scale of her son's criminal liability was laid bare in front of international financiers. Abigail stopped pacing and stood directly across the table from Klaus. She delivered the final fatal blow to her brother empire. She informed the board that she had not merely purchased a derelict brick building. When she executed the buyout of the Apex property, she had legally acquired the remaining holding company in its entirety. That purchase included all legacy assets, all physical property, and most importantly, its entire intellectual property portfolio. Abigail stated with absolute unwavering authority that she was the sole legal owner of the ecopolymer patent. She looked directly at Trent. He was clutching his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Abigail turned back to the investors and spelled out the devastating reality of their situation. Every single architectural framework Trent had designed was based on her material. Every building blueprint, every thermal regulation system, and every marketing brochure Silicon Vista had ever produced was a direct, undeniable patent infringement. She promised the syndicate that if they broke ground on a single building, using her proprietary technology, Evelyn Sterling and her team of federal litigators would immediately file injunctions that would freeze their assets for a decade. She would sue for total ownership of the project and claim every single penny of generated profit. Trent had not just offered them a project without utilities. He had offered them an illegal stolen blueprint that would drag them into the largest intellectual property lawsuit in corporate history. The boardroom erupted. The polite silence of the billionaire class vanished, replaced by shouts of outrage and furious demands for accountability. The investors realized that Trent had lured them into a toxic radioactive trap. Without the land, they could not build. Without the patent, the technology did not exist. The $500 million smart city was nothing more than a criminal mirage. Klaus stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. He did not shout. He simply picked up his gold fountain pen, looked at Trent with absolute, utter disgust, and snapped the pen cleanly in half. He dropped the broken pieces onto the ruined contract. The message was clear. Trent was finished. The two halves of the shattered gold Mont Blanc pen bled black ink across the signature line of the $500 million contract. The sharp crack of the metal snapping echoed in the dead silence of the boardroom, acting as the ultimate starting gun for the absolute destruction of Silicon Vista. The momentary quiet shattered into a deafening roar of corporate outrage. The investors did not just stand up, they erupted. Chairs were violently shoved backwards, scraping loudly against the hardwood floors. The polite, restrained demeanor of the international billionaire class evaporated instantly, completely, replaced by the brutal, aggressive fury of apex predators who realized they had just been led into a slaughterhouse. The representative from the Dubai consortium slammed his heavy leather briefcase onto the marble table. He began shoving his documents into the bag without bothering to organize them. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Trent, his voice booming over the chaos. He officially and unequivocally revoked their term sheet. He shouted that Trent had intentionally presented fraudulent due diligence materials, falsified land access records, and lied about the foundational intellectual property of the entire development. The European banking magnate was next. He did not even look at Trent. He turned his furious gaze entirely upon Richard. He spat out that the family reputation was a complete scam. He loudly declared that any association with the Apex property development would invite an avalanche of federal intellectual property litigation. The investors knew exactly who Evelyn Sterling was, and they knew her presence meant the Department of Justice was likely already drafting indictments. They understood instantly that moving forward with the smart city meant entangling their own pristine offshore holding companies in a radioactive federal fraud investigation. Trent threw himself forward, his hands slapping against the glass tabletop. He begged them to wait. He promised he could restructure the deal, offer them an unprecedented equity split, and personally guarantee the rerouting of the subterranean cooling grids. He was sweating profusely, his perfectly styled hair plastered to his forehead, his voice cracking with unadulterated panic. He sounded like a desperate child begging for a second chance. Klaus buttoned his suit jacket with chilling, terrifying calmness. He looked down at Trent as if examining a repulsive insect that had crawled onto his shoe. Klaus did not raise his voice, but his words cut through the screaming boardroom with lethal precision. He informed Trent that there would be no restructuring and no second chances. Klaus promised that before his private jet landed back in Geneva, his own legal team would file a massive retaliatory lawsuit against Silicon Vista. He guaranteed that the syndicate would sue Trent personally for gross misrepresentation, deliberate financial fraud, and the catastrophic waste of their institutional capital. Klaus promised to freeze whatever liquid assets Trent had left just to cover the cost of the plane fuel it took to fly to this disastrous meeting. Patricia let out a loud, choked sob, covering her face with her trembling hands. Her pristine, aristocratic illusion was entirely shattered. She was watching her golden child, the son she had sacrificed everything to protect, being publicly slaughtered by the exact people he had promised to conquer. Richard stood frozen, his jaw slack, his chest tight with impending cardiac stress. He tried to reach out to Klaus to offer a patriarch handshake to smooth over the disaster, but Klaus simply brushed past him without a single glance. Richard's authority meant absolutely nothing. He was just another fraudulent liability standing in the way of the exit. The exodus was swift and merciless. The billionaires signaled their private security details. The massive mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom were thrown wide open. The investors marched out in a tight, unyielding formation, their expensive leather shoes hammering against the floorboards. They left the room carrying their wealth, their influence, and their legal protection with them. They did not look back. Trent was left standing alone at the head of the ruined conference table. He was gasping for air, his hands gripping the edge of the marble so tightly his fingers were turning blue. The $500 million contract lay completely ruined, covered in splattered black ink. Abigail remained exactly where she stood. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply watched the absolute destruction of her brother empire with the cold, detached satisfaction of an architect admiring a perfectly executed demolition. Evelyn Sterling calmly began packing her devastating legal dossiers back into her briefcases, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the emptied boardroom was pierced by a sharp electronic buzz. Trent's smartphone vibrated violently on the table. He flinched, staring at the glowing screen as if it were a live grenade. Then Richard's phone began to ring, a loud, obnoxious corporate ringtone that he scrambled to silence. A second later, Patricia's luxury handbag buzzed as her phone lit up. Trent slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up his device. The screen was flooded with a cascading waterfall of high-priority push notifications and emergency financial alerts. Evelyn Sterling paused at the door, adjusting her blazer. She offered Trent a razor-thin smile. She casually mentioned that she had filed the intellectual property infringement lawsuit on the public federal docket the exact second Abigail walked into the boardroom. The corporate financial blogs utilize automated legal scraping algorithms. The moment a massive IP fraud lawsuit was filed against Silicon Vista Primary Holding Company, the algorithms automatically triggered a massive global sell-off. Trent stared at his screen, his mouth falling open in a silent scream of absolute horror. The live ticker tape for his primary real estate holding company was completely stained in aggressive flashing red numbers. Word had leaked to the institutional trading floors. The market realized that Silicon Vista possessed zero land rights and zero proprietary technology. Panic selling had initiated a total uncontrolled freefall. Trent watched the stock graph plummet straight down like a lead weight thrown from a skyscraper. He watched 10% of his net worth evaporate in seconds, then 20%. By the time he looked up at Abigail with completely dead, terrified eyes, his holding company stock had dropped an apocalyptic 40% in less than 10 minutes. The money was gone. The investors were gone. The empire was officially burning to the ground. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind the final departing investor, sealing the vast boardroom. The sudden isolation transformed the executive suite into a tomb. The air was entirely devoid of the electric corporate energy that had fueled Trent just an hour prior. Now, the only sound vibrating against the acoustic panels was the ragged, wet sound of Trent desperately gasping for oxygen. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes catching on the edge of the area rug. His legs gave out completely. He crashed heavily into a low, modern armchair, his spine hitting the upholstery with a dull thud. He tore frantically at his silk tie, ripping it away from his throat as a full-blown panic attack seized his chest. His bespoke suit was soaked in cold sweat, his perfectly styled hair plastered flat against his forehead. The monitor at the end of the table was still flashing the plummeting stock prices of his primary holding company, but Trent was no longer looking at the numbers. He was staring blindly at the splattered black ink of Klaus' broken fountain pen. The reality of his absolute destruction was setting in. He was not merely bankrupt. He had committed massive international wire fraud, forged municipal documents, and stolen intellectual property in front of the most ruthless financial syndicate on the planet. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Richard stood paralyzed beside the conference table, his hands hovering uselessly over the ruined $500 million contract. His jaw hung slack. His eyes were wide and unblinking. The patriarch of the family had spent his entire life building an empire of intimidation and false prestige, meticulously paving a golden road for his son while systematically crushing his daughter. He had believed his own lies. He had truly believed Trent was a visionary, and Abigail was a defective liability. Watching the international billionaires march out of the room promising catastrophic retaliatory lawsuits had completely broken his mind. Patricia was the first to physically break. The pristine aristocratic mask she had worn for 3 decades melted away in a matter of seconds. The smug superiority, the quiet condescension, the perfectly manicured disdain, all of it evaporated, leaving behind a terrified aging woman staring directly into the abyss of total destitution. Her legs buckled beneath her white designer suit. She did not just sit down, she collapsed. She slid off the edge of her luxury gallery chair and dropped heavily onto her knees on the polished hardwood floor. The sharp crack of her knees hitting the wood echoed loudly in the quiet room. She did not care about her dignity. She did not care about her ruined stockings. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, closing the distance between the gallery seating and the head of the glass table where Abigail stood. Patricia began to weep. It was not a quiet, elegant cry. It was a loud, ugly, hysterical sobbing. Dark streaks of expensive mascara ran down her pale cheeks, dropping onto her pristine lapels. She reached her trembling hands upward, desperately trying to grasp the hem of Abigail's charcoal dress. Abigail took one slow, deliberate step backward, placing herself entirely out of her mother's reach. "Abigail, please!" Patricia choked out, her voice raw and scratching with panic. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot do this to your brother. He made a mistake. It was just a stupid, arrogant mistake. You have to fix this." Patricia clawed at the edge of the glass table, pulling herself up slightly. She begged Abigail to sign the municipal land rights over to the holding company. She pleaded with her to transfer the ecopolymer patent back into the family trust. She promised that if Abigail just signed the papers, Trent could call Klaus from the tarmac and save the deal. "We are your family!" Patricia wailed, her voice breaking into a shrill shriek. "We are blood, Abigail! You cannot send your own flesh and blood to federal prison. You cannot let them bankrupt your father and me. We will lose the estate. We will lose everything. Please just give him the patent. We will make it right. We promise we will treat you differently. Just save us." Richard dropped to his knees right beside his wife. The proud, tyrannical father who had mocked Abigail's ambitions and actively funded Trent theft was now groveling on the floor like a beaten dog. He looked up at Abigail, his hands clasped together in front of his chest. His voice shook violently as he offered her equity cash board seats, anything she wanted, if she would simply surrender her leverage and save his golden child from the Department of Justice. Abigail looked down at the 2 people who had brought her into the world. She looked at the parents who had starved her of affection, dismissed her brilliance, and gladly watched Trent try to destroy her life. She searched her own heart, expecting to feel a surge of triumphant vindication, or perhaps a lingering echo of the childhood sorrow that used to consume her. She felt absolutely nothing. The well of her empathy was completely bone dry. She had spent 30 years modifying her behavior, shrinking her ambition, and begging for a single scrap of their validation. She realized in that moment of absolute clarity that they had never loved Trent because he was better, and they had never hated her because she was worse. They simply loved the reflection of their own narcissism that Trent provided. Even now, on their knees sobbing and begging, they were not apologizing for the abuse. They were not sorry for the theft. They were only sorry they had been caught, and they were only begging because she held the keys to their survival. Trent let out a loud, pathetic whine from his chair, covering his face with his arms, refusing to even look at the sister he had tried to ruin. Abigail did not offer them forgiveness. She did not offer them anger closure or a dramatic speech about their failures. They were no longer worth her emotional energy. She simply looked down at them with cold, absolute detachment. She turned her head slightly to the left, making direct eye contact with Evelyn Sterling. Abigail gave a single brief nod. Evelyn stepped forward, her expression entirely devoid of sympathy. She moved with the lethal efficiency of a corporate executioner. She did not reach for the massive dossiers of federal evidence or the offshore banking records. Instead, Evelyn unclasped a secondary hidden compartment in her leather briefcase. She reached inside and slowly extracted two stark, single-page documents. Evelyn walked around the groveling forms of Richard and Patricia and placed the two pieces of paper completely flat on the center of the glass table directly under the glare of the overhead lights. Evelyn smoothed the edges of the heavy, crisp paper. Trent stared at the stark black text as if it were a physical weapon. The sharp contrast of the documents against the pristine glass surface felt like a guillotine waiting to drop. Abigail stepped out from the shadows of the room and stood directly over the contracts. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to shout. The quiet, lethal authority in her tone commanded absolute obedience. She pointed a manicured finger at the first document. She told Trent to read it. When his bloodshot eyes could not focus through his hyperventilation, she read it for him. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable. The first contract demanded the total, immediate, and irrevocable transfer of his holding company. Every single share of stock, every subsidiary, every bank account, and every asset under the Silicon Vista umbrella would be signed over directly to Abigail Private, LLC. The purchase price was listed as exactly $1. Abigail reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer. She extracted a heavy silver dollar coin. She placed it on the glass table and slid it forward. It glided across the smooth surface and hit Trent Knuckles with a sharp metallic clink. Trent recoiled as if the coin had burned him. He choked out a pathetic protest, stammering that Silicon Vista was his life work, his entire future. Abigail leaned in close, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. She reminded him that he had no life work. His entire empire was constructed on a foundation of stolen intellectual property and fabricated municipal blueprints. The silver dollar she offered was a generous overpayment for a company consisting entirely of federal liabilities. She explained the brutal reality of his situation. If he signed the document, she would absorb the company and shield him from the civil litigation regarding the eco-polymer patent. She would bury the corporate espionage charges. If he refused, she would let the international syndicate tear him to pieces in civil court, while the Department of Justice indicted him for wire fraud. Trent squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving as a fresh wave of panic washed over him. He looked desperately down at his father, hoping the patriarch would somehow intervene and negotiate a better deal. Richard was entirely silent, his hands trembling violently against the hardwood floor. Abigail did not even allow them a moment to breathe. She immediately shifted her gaze to her parents and tapped the second sheet of paper. This contract was specifically designed for the architects of her lifelong misery. Abigail laid out the terms of their survival. The second contract was a binding, irrevocable, and totally public admission of guilt. Richard and Patricia would sign a sworn affidavit confessing to their decades of financial fraud, their active complicity in funding Trent corporate espionage, and their systematic, deliberate slander of Abigail's professional reputation. The document would be filed in open court. It would become permanent public record, accessible to every single country club member, banking associate, and high society friend they possessed. Patricia let out a strangled shriek. She clawed at her own hair, her perfect salon blowout completely ruined. She cried that a public admission would destroy them. The banks would instantly call in their massive lines of credit. They would be forced to sell the family estate. They would be paraded through the local media as common criminals and shunned by everyone in their elite social circle. Abigail stared at her mother with eyes as cold as absolute zero. She stated that the destruction of their pristine, fraudulent image was exactly the point. They had worshipped their social standing above the well-being of their own daughter, so the price of their freedom was the complete incineration of that fake prestige. But the public confession was only the first half of their punishment. Abigail outlined the final clause of the second contract. It contained a permanent, legally binding restraining order. The document explicitly severed all familial, financial, and legal ties between Abigail and her parents. They were permanently barred from contacting her, attempting to visit her, or claiming her as their daughter in any capacity. If they went bankrupt, she would not offer them a single penny. If they fell ill, she would not visit them. They were to be entirely erased from her life. Richard tried to scramble up from his knees, but his legs failed him. He collapsed back down, grasping the edge of a chair. He begged Abigail to keep the settlement private. He pleaded with her to handle the dispute internally, promising that he would instantly make her a full equity partner in the family legacy. He swore things would be different. He swore they finally recognized her brilliance. Abigail cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. She informed him that the family legacy was already dead and buried. She raised her left arm and looked at the heavy gold watch strapped to her wrist. The rhythmic ticking of the second hand seemed to echo violently against the acoustic panels of the empty boardroom. She looked directly into Trent's tear-streaked face and then down at her groveling parents. She delivered her absolute final ultimatum. There would be no negotiations, there would be no revised drafts or prolonged legal debates. They had exactly 60 seconds to pick up the silver pens sitting on the table and sign their names on the dotted lines. Abigail stated with chilling clarity that if the second hand completed its revolution and the ink was not on the paper, Evelyn Sterling had a direct mandate to hit send on her secure laptop. That single keystroke would instantly transmit the entire offshore banking ledger, the forged municipal land documents, and the undeniable proof of bribery, straight to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the rapid, shallow breathing of a family watching their destruction tick closer second by second. 10 seconds passed. Trent looked at the digital clock on the wall. 20 seconds. The reality of a federal penitentiary flashed before his eyes. He let out a loud, guttural wail of pure defeat. He scrambled out of his chair, his expensive shoes slipping on the rug. He threw his upper body across the glass table and snatched the heavy silver pen. His hand shook so violently he could barely press the nib to the paper. With tears dripping from his chin onto the contract, Trent violently scratched his signature across the bottom of the first page. He surrendered his entire fraudulent empire, his future, and his pride for a single silver coin. He dropped the pen and collapsed backward into his chair, burying his face in his hands. 40 seconds remained. Richard stared at the FBI threat hanging like a physical blade over his neck. He looked up at the iron resolve radiating from his daughter's eyes. He knew with absolute certainty that she was not bluffing. The father, who had spent his entire life acting like an untouchable king, slowly reached up and took the pen from the table. His shoulders slumped forward, entirely broken by the weight of his own hubris. He signed his ruin, his bankruptcy, and his public disgrace into existence. Richard handed the pen down to his wife. 50 seconds. Patricia was sobbing so hysterically she was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved as she stared at the restraining order that would sever her from the daughter she had abused and the high society life she worshipped. With 5 seconds left on the ticking watch, Patricia snatched the pen and scribbled her name through blinding tears. The ink smeared slightly under her trembling hand. They were completely and utterly defeated. The ink smearing under Patricia's trembling hand was the final definitive stroke that killed the family dynasty. Abigail did not linger to watch her parents weep or to hear Trent gasp for air in the ruins of his shattered ego. She simply stepped forward, collected the 2 signed contracts, handed them to Evelyn Sterling, and walked out of the boardroom without a single backward glance. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind her, sealing her abusers in a tomb of their own making. The silence she left in her wake was the sound of a toxic empire collapsing into dust. 6 months later, the absolute reality of that collapse had settled into a brutal, inescapable daily routine. Trent was a ghost of the golden boy who had once commanded international syndicates and flaunted $500 million valuations. Abigail had shown him a sliver of mercy by keeping the federal bribery and forgery evidence out of the hands of the FBI, saving him from a jumpsuit and a cell block. However, she had not shielded him from the wrath of the billionaires he had tried to defraud. The civil lawsuits from the Dubai Consortium and the European banking magnates had hit Trent like a financial firing squad. Stripped of his holding company, his assets completely frozen, and his professional reputation rendered highly radioactive, Trent was forced into manual survival. He now sat behind a cheap laminate desk under flickering fluorescent lights, working a minimum-wage customer service job at a regional logistics firm. His bespoke tailored suits had been repossessed and replaced by a stiff, uncomfortable poly-blend company polo. He spent his long, agonizing days answering calls from angry shipping clients, his spirit utterly crushed by the suffocating weight of massive legal debts he could never hope to pay off in 10 lifetimes. Every time his phone rang, he jumped, haunted by the memory of his catastrophic downfall. Jasmine had executed her own ruthless exit strategy with flawless, terrifying precision. Armed with the offshore banking ledgers, the undeniable proof of Trent's infidelity, and the comprehensive evidence of his corporate fraud, she had filed for divorce before the ink on Abigail's contracts was even fully dry. The presiding judge had taken one look at the sheer magnitude of Trent's deception and delivered a merciless ruling. Jasmine was awarded full custody of their remaining private assets, including the luxury penthouse, the luxury vehicles, and the diversified investment portfolios. She left Trent with absolutely nothing but his staggering debts and a cardboard box of cheap clothes. Jasmine did not retreat into quiet obscurity after her victory. She had tasted the intoxicating power of absolute leverage, and she knew exactly where her talents belonged. Richard and Patricia experienced a downfall that was shockingly fast and completely merciless. Their legally binding, highly public admission of slander and fraud had triggered an instantaneous excommunication from the elite society they had worshipped above their own daughter. The country club formally revoked their lifetime membership via a cold 2-sentence email delivered by a junior assistant. Their prestigious banking partners, terrified of the toxic fallout, immediately called in the massive, over-leveraged lines of credit that had propped up their lavish, fake lifestyle. Forced into abrupt and humiliating bankruptcy, the bank foreclosed on the sprawling family estate within weeks. The patriarchal king and the aristocratic queen were banished to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. Patricia spent her days sitting on a cheap sofa, staring blankly at peeling wallpaper, entirely unable to show her face at the local grocery store without triggering pointing fingers and hushed whispers from former friends. Richard sat across from her in a stained armchair, a defeated, silent old man who had traded his legacy to protect a fraud and ended up losing everything. The permanent restraining order ensured they were entirely severed from Abigail, trapped in a sterile, agonizing isolation of their own design. Contrast their total ruin with Abigail's soaring triumph. The derelict Apex warehouse had undergone a breathtaking high-tech metamorphosis. It was no longer a crumbling brick relic filled with rusted machinery and forgotten ghosts. It was the pulsing state of the art heart of a new industrial revolution. The exposed brick had been sandblasted clean and reinforced with sleek steel beams and massive panes of floor-to-ceiling smart glass. The cavernous interior was now a bustling tech incubator and the central global hub for the distribution of the ecopolymer technology. Brilliant materials, engineers, aggressive startup founders, and international supply chain executives moved rapidly through the sunlit corridors. Abigail had not just preserved her grandfather's legacy, she had weaponized it, turning a forgotten rusted asset into a billion-dollar reality. Abigail stood on the newly constructed rooftop garden of the Apex building, breathing in the cool evening air. The setting sun cast a brilliant golden glow over the city skyline, reflecting off the glass towers in the distance. The air tasted of hard-won victory and absolute freedom. The heavy glass door behind her clicked open, and footsteps sounded against the wooden decking. Jasmine walked onto the terrace, her posture radiating the sharp, lethal confidence of a woman who had conquered her own demons and claimed her power. Jasmine was no longer a silent trophy wife, standing in the shadow of a fraud. She was the newly appointed chief legal officer of Abigail's rapidly expanding empire. Jasmine stepped up to the glass railing and handed Abigail a crystal flute filled with premium vintage champagne. The two women stood side by side, looking out over the sprawling city they had successfully taken by storm. They clinked their glasses together, the clear chime ringing out in the quiet evening air. It was a silent, powerful toast to dead weight permanently discarded, and new empires built on unyielding truth. As they drank the sparkling wine, a final lingering thought hung over the horizon. If the very people who were supposed to love and protect you left you to drown in the dark, would you use your newfound success to utterly destroy them? Or would you simply take their empire, claim your crown, and walk away into the sun?